All right, welcome everybody to SIG Architecture for May 4th, 2023. Looks like we have a pretty light agenda for today. So yeah, go ahead and jump in. Peter, want to talk through this?
Your audio, Peter.
Software muted. Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you. Yeah, so hi, I'm Peter Hunt. I usually reside in SIG Node, but I was referred here because of a change that I was thinking about making in the qubit might apply to other components, and I wanted to get feedback from SIG Arch to see if I should expand the scope a little bit. Basically, in the qubit, we're planning on doing some deprecation of some CLI flags, and that will affect something that we rely on in the downstream. I work on Red Hat, so OpenShift relies on. So we have been thinking about adding support for a drop-in configuration similar to like systemd, where in addition to the qubit, etc Kubernetes qubit.conf, we'd have an xe Kubernetes qubit.conf.d, and then that directory would be, you could apply more configuration options in files, and they would be ordered in precedence based on that. So I was referred here to check to see if we should expand the scope to include other built-in components. From my understanding, it seems like it could just be a qubit implementation detail and not necessarily need a feature gate, or I probably would have a KEP, but I don't think that it would necessarily need to. It doesn't seem like the kind of change that would need to go through the traditional life cycle of like moving to stable. It just, it is a detail of like where the qubit looks for its configuration. But I was wondering if there's a way that I should go about it such that other components could maybe opt into this as well, or if I should include in the original proposal, including other components that rely on a configuration file.
Is the what's the interaction between the existing qubit configuration file and what's being discussed for this?
So the idea, so the way that it works in most services, this is kind of a fairly common pattern. The default qubit file would act as a base. Well, the built-in configuration of the qubit, like in the binary, would act as a basis, and then it would get overridden immediately by the default qubit config file, and then all of the files within the directory would then override that. So on a node that like didn't have any qubit.conf.d, but did have a qubit.conf, the behavior would be as one expected in the past, where it would just inherit that from the qubit.conf. But if there was that .d directory, or that .d directory was populated with something, then that would override the default configuration.
I know there's been maybe 3 or 4 or 5 attempts at like merged kubelet configuration in the past. I'm curious what is different, or like what simplifying assumptions, or what is different about this discussion that is sort of getting around some of the problems we hit in the past that stalled those merge discussions?
That's a good question. I actually don't personally have a lot of background on the issue. I, brought it up to SIGNode and, we've been thinking about it for a little bit internally, but I haven't admittedly done the research here.
Peter,
Derek, do you have background here?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So in the past, we had obviously a large number of discrete flags as arguments to the kubelet binary. Then historically, we went and said we want to eliminate those flags in favor of pointing to a configuration file whose format was well understood. And that's how we ended up with the kubelet.conf that we have today. And in parallel to the effort, we had the feature which was dynamic kubelet config, which was allowing you to manage the configuration of the kubelet from the centralized control plane itself. And that resulted in a number of complex orchestration steps to track last known good config and figuring out how to safely roll those configurations out. For folks who aren't aware, we deprecated dynamic kubelet config, and it never got broad community exploration or adoption, which was not, input obviously into why we deprecated it. What I see as different here with the conf.d proposal that Peter's talking about is, one, it's a common pattern with many of the runtimes that the kubelet already depends upon, where the packager of the runtime or the operating system or kubelet will, whether that's cryo or the any other CRI implementer, this pattern of overrides and conf.d generally is just pretty much, I want to say, standard by convention, I feel like, on Linux hosts. And it tries to get people to avoid overriding maybe files with large numbers of config versus just making a sparse local change. But the major difference here is that, you know, there's no orchestration, or there's no maybe confusion on shared ownership of these config files that might occur. Whereas today, if you have users who want to make overrides to the default kubelet configuration that might come from their vendor or packager, they end up with a shared ownership problem on who maintains this file and how they diff their configuration choices. And I feel like, Peter, if I'm not mistaken, much of the reason for this comp.d pattern is to avoid that shared ownership tension. Like the specific motivations for this is also the types of things that you might want to override in your comp.d file might vary by node instance type. So for example, you might want to vary your system reservation or your cube reservation on a per host basis. And a comp.d drop-in is a nice pattern for that, where you might not want to vary, for example, your socket that you use to connect to the container runtime of choice. And so putting that configuration in the more global kubelet.conf would be a clear separation of concern. So yeah. That's probably the best summary I would have for it. And I think the question we have in SIG node is like less about like the applicability of the pattern and its benefit, like frankly, in the ecosystem components we depend on, and more like, did anyone else ever encounter this with like Kube API or Kube Controller Manager, or any other adjacent component that, like, do we want to write down architectural conventions and best practices around this as a part of this enhancement, or should we treat it as a SIG node local problem? But hopefully, Jordan, that answers your questions.
Yeah, I swear we've had like these exact conversations before. I remember Stefan going off and trying to like figure out the semantics of merging config files. So like that's one aspect. Like, is it well defined to have a base kubelet config and then like have a directory with other things in it? Like, is it well defined what you end up with? And maybe if everything in the config is like just key value pairs, you can do a merge, like sorted by directory file name or something, and it's well defined. But I think when we got into like anytime there was a list inside the config file, merges got weird. So there was sort of a, I don't know, Stefan was going down a rabbit hole trying to figure out, like, do we allow merging and overriding anything or just a subset of things? And I think he was approaching it from sort of a generic component config perspective. Like, kubelet is probably the clearest example where we want to do instance overrides, but kube proxy is sort of similar. Because you can have like specific addresses that are local to the node that are you want to override while inheriting a base config. Yeah, so I think some of it would be applicable to just things consuming config files generally. And then the questions I would have about it would be like, is it well defined for all the things that are in the kubelet config files, like what you end up with?
So a lot of my background is with running, working with Cryo. And in Cryo, there are a couple of exceptions where we do allow for list merges instead of an override. But the base pattern is just an override. So if you define the field, then it's just going to replace it, even if it is a list. I think that we probably would need to just be opinionated. And I think it would be simplest. And like the reason that we went through the like merging for the handful of like, there's like 2 fields, I think, maybe even just 1 where we do that. And that was to allow for people to add additional OCI runtimes and it like not need to inherit all of this information about what the baseline OCI runtimes are to include those in the list while also adding additional ones. I think that as a cluster admin, those kinds of little a list merge might be convenient in some cases, but it would also be incredibly limiting if I wanted to override it completely. There would be no way to like completely change the list, where there is a possibility of reading the base config file to get the base list and then writing an override that includes that base list. So just override, a blanket statement override is more expressive. And I can imagine if we were to standardize this behavior across components, we'd probably want to take the most expressive route.
Yeah, I will take an AI to try to dig up some of the historical discussions about this. I think like at the 10,000 foot view, it seems simple, and then you zoom in and you realize like, oh yeah, what about empty values? And what about like when I serialize a struct that I didn't give a value to, but like the type definition didn't do omit empty properly. So when I serialize my override file, I actually end up with like a ton of fields with empty string values. Like how do we merge those? Do those get to clear values from the parent config? Like, so the devil's definitely in the details.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the things that we've encountered too, is like the empty value problem is a big one. And I don't know if I have an answer to that. Like there are cases where like, maybe we did want to empty out the value of a field, but the way that, I mean, we use TOML, not YAML for our configuration, but the TOML parser that we have got confused by empty files. So I'm not so sure about that one. And so I understand your larger point, which is that a conceptually simple change might end up being more complicated. What is then your feedback for the broader question? Like, given that it's likely to be more difficult than I originally posed as, does this seem like something that the Kubernetes community wants to standardize around and have the behavior semantics standardized, or is that something that SIG Arch is like fine with SIG Node, just figuring out for ourselves.
I can't. Sorry,
Go ahead.
one thought that I had when I just saw the goals here. I can't speak for a community, but as a user of kubeadm, I've always wondered what will happen if kubelet actually deprecates the command line flags, because as far as I know, if you deploy a cluster, kubeadm in its current API can only add kubelet parameters, but it can't modify the config. Perhaps I'm mistaken, but before you go ahead with deprecating and removing these flags, it might be worth investigating how that'll affect the ecosystem, which currently depends on those flags.
To be clear, we're not in this discussion removing or deprecating any flag. I'm saying historically, the kubelet did deprecate flags, which led us to the configuration file format. But in this particular conversation, there's no desire to deprecate any flag or change the inputs to the binary. The debate right now is if, in addition to one comp file, can you provide a override comp file for where localized changes could be beneficial and improve management. So I just want to make sure there's no confusion on that point, and that pattern is one that we know the broader OCI runtime community uses commonly to provide local tweaks, and so we're aware that pattern's not out of the norm, I guess, and so the natural inclination was to say, should the kubelet embrace that pattern? And like Peter said, the debate was, is that something we want to standardize on the community writ large? My own opinion, just to share here, is I'm not advocating for that. Like that everyone doesn't need to take on a problem that they have and may or may not have. But I can appreciate the shared ownership of a config file problem that is definitely available node local. And so Jordan, the kubeproxy example I think is similar. But anyway, it was my ask to Peter to come here and try to get everyone else's perspectives as well. But I'll just put my own perspective on the table at least.
I think the parts that touch SIG Arch, so like we have API conventions that are sort of hard learned lessons about things that work well or don't work well in REST APIs. It would be helpful if we identify things that work well or don't work well in configuration files that you want to merge together, to have sort of a section of the API conventions that talk about things focused on those uses. So like that's where I think it would intersect with SIG Arch and probably SIG API machinery. So API machinery owns sort of the generic, load types from disk, serialized types to disk, and SIG Arch has the guidelines for like when you make your type definitions, here's how you should make them. And so making sure that both of those SIGs are in the loop in terms of updating guidance and making sure the mechanics and tools that we have support the kinds of merges that you want to do. And I mean, kubelet config is in beta still. If there are things that you realize you need to change, not big things, but like we need to add omit empty, or we need to, not dump out empty values by default. Like those are the kinds of things that could be reasonable to do in a V1 cleanup. V1 looks a lot like V1 beta 1, but serializes better, throws less junk out into a file, and as a side benefit, merges better for something like this. That might be
something. That makes total sense. So I could agree with that, Jordan. I guess, but you, as an extension of that, you wouldn't say that every binary from the Kubernetes community should or must follow a comp.d override, right? Like, no,
not at all.
That's what I'm trying to make sure we don't have to sign up. I totally agree that as a convention, we should author like what is being done. But I didn't want to make it I didn't want to put a burden on anybody who didn't feel a burden. And that's
I would see it as blazing a trail, saying like we're going to figure out how to do it. We're going to figure out things that need to change or be added in API machinery, and things that we need to change in the kubelet or improve in our config files on the way to making these things mergeable, and then write down that path so that if someone wants to do this in the future, we actually have approach we recommend as a project.
So is that a clear next step, Peter?
Totally. That makes sense to me.
Can I say something? So before we go going back to API side, it's not trivial today to know which configuration node is running with, and with dynamic kubelet config, we used to have this endpoint to check current configuration. So maybe introducing, like, if you introduce overrides and make configuration harder, maybe we need to restore this check current configuration endpoint, and it will force us to do more of GA of specific API surface and config surface.
Yeah, that gets into like kubelet endpoints and what API surface we support there. And before we start publishing things that we have guarantees about from kubelet, I would really like whatever we publish to be something stable. So like I know we already have the config.z endpoint from kubelet. Before we start making promises about that, it would be really great if that could actually be like a V1 config and then be supported.
Yeah, and then there's other ways that that problem could be solved. Like the kubelet could write out its
Effective
effective config to some location, whether that's temp disk or some well-known location. Like it doesn't need to serve it necessarily. Which is basically the pattern I kind of view last known good config doing with dynamic kubelet config in practice. So yeah, I agree, Sergey. We would want an easy way to introspect our understanding of what the config is.
Yeah, and another point I wanted to make that whenever there is overrides, people tend to do like just dump base config and then try to do everything with overrides so people see what base config is. And it may not be ideal practice for us because it will, like, if we change default or like attempt to change something, introduce new setting, then customer may not react on that as well as it happens today. Like I think today people tend to have kubelet config very minimal.
Maybe Sergey could do that as a risk, I guess. Is
Yeah,
that
just
an argument
something to
against
think
doing
about.
it? I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Maybe we need to think how to avoid abusing it the way we don't want people to use it. But I don't think it's a big. I think it's a risk, but it's not a blocker to any means.
So it sounds like, if we're getting into some of the grittier details of it, I think that given all the conversation and some of the risks that both Sergey and Jordan mentioned, I think that I will definitely draft up a CAP and spell out kind of the steps of defining the behavior, what kind of documentation pieces are needed for that, and then spell out some of the risks for SIG node specifically as a project for, some of the ways that this could be misused or, directions that it could go poorly.
Yeah, principle of least surprise is always good. So making sure people can actually understand what they're running and thinking through like how the validation stuff interacts with it. Like if I give you a base config, should we validate that and then merge in stuff and then validate it again? And yeah, just trying to understand all the flows and that you end up with something deterministic.
Totally, makes sense. All right, well, I'll draft that up and then I'm sure I can tag any of you that want to be in on the conversation. So
cool, thanks. It looks like we grew some more agenda items. So maybe you want to talk through the ones you added in?
I'll TLDR, I'd like to shut down prow.cncf.io and move everything into prow.cates.io. We're heavily involved with SIG Cates Infra. And there's some PR, some release blocking jobs that we'd like to put in, and anything release or PR blocking needs to be run and owned by the community. We've talked about it for years, but never gotten around to it. And I wanted to see if SIG architecture wouldn't let API Snoop become a sub project so that it's got the formal blessing of being run and owned by the community. We're still going to do the work. Nothing really changes there. It's just that access to it and the structure in which it runs is more formally done by the community rather than just a contracting group. There's more details to come, but it kind of comes to putting this in front of the of SIG architecture here to get any feedback or thoughts on that. Then the approach, so we can start putting something to figure out all the exact steps if that's what we want to do.
Are there any thoughts on this? I mean, it's definitely worth adding to the mailing list just to get
Yeah,
attention from folks who aren't here or aren't in Slack.
can do. We'll follow up there. And that's kind of merging into the second one. There are some release blocking jobs that we're ignoring them kind of right now, but it will make a lot more sense if those release blocking jobs, when we have promotions, for example, for GA endpoints, we need the whole, needs to be part of the release blocking process so that can be part of conformance or demotion of those. So we don't have a release that includes endpoints that don't have conformance tests.
The changes to broken conformance tests, I thought we already ran conformance in pre-submits and
Not pre-submits right now. Not that this is a difference in a release blocking job. And then I think that second point is we had some recent changes to the EDE framework that broke, and I think it had to do with how the updater works within the EDE, the Kubernetes /testing/EDE framework. They updated the Ginkgo 2 or 3. I forget the exact specifics, but there was some issues there. But I think the main point of showing up here was to kind of talk about the donation, and to see, because a lot of this stuff will. Just a second.
My interest here, I joined the meeting because of this topic here, because I know that we broke something and later on.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Sorry.
After the release, we got contacted by people running Sonoboy and were asked to fix something that broke in the release as part of a V2 migration. And it would have been nice to hear about that before the release. So I'm now wondering, are these jobs running the E2E test binary exactly the way how people will do conformance tests? That would be the main difference compared to the other existing jobs that we have, which run the tests, but they do it with our shell script and not the way how conformance testing is done later on after the release. So that's where we have additional features in the E2E framework, like the HTTP progress reporting. That's the one that actually broke or behaved differently. It's still broken because it's conceptually broken, but that's a different topic. But that's what we got a bug report about, and I'm just wondering whether this is something that we can detect earlier with some other job.
Patrick, you're right, and I think one of another job along making sure that the test works, we don't promote, is part of the release process of ensuring, because most people do run Sonoboy. So having Sonoboy running in the way that most people run it to ensure that creates submissions that we can just approve would be good, because it's part of our. We have to rush around and do this every release to make sure that the changes, and we don't know about it until release week. and people start trying to get their submissions in early. In addition to making sure we don't promote new endpoints, making sure that the process that the community uses to get conformance is part of our release blocking process.
It does make sense to me, but then I wonder about the Sonoboy dependency. If that is release blocking, what do we do if something breaks and who's going to fix it? This is the concern that I have. As much as I would like to know about it sooner so that I can still do something before release, yeah, if it's not just the code that I broke, what do I do?
Yeah, it's kind of strange to block the Kubernetes release on an external project that we don't control.
Let me put that down. Release informing, because it's my team that has to go through and
Yeah,
relationeering and make sure that Sonoboy and people, we work together on.
yeah. I mean, having it running is a good first step. If it can make use of some of the new infra budget on some of the new
I'm trying.
then informing seems plausible. Knowing there's an issue is better than not knowing. And then if it's our issue, we can fix it. And if it's a Sonoboy issue, then hopefully they fix it. And if they don't, then we go out at least informed.
Yeah. Release blocking on unintentional promotions of GA endpoints and information informing if we break the process for submitting conformance tests.
Yeah, I'm actually fuzzy. What is the documented tool that people are supposed to use to run conformance?
It's Sonoboy right now. So if you go to
okay.
Kubernetes, sorry, if you go to github.com/cncf/k8-conformance, there's a README there with the process for the submission. It is Sonoboy, and we can change this, right? We can say, again, it was early days when all that occurred. So another process might be just to remove the dependency on Sonoboy, but it does a lot of the heavy lifting currently.
Yeah.
Get them to donate it. This is another process. But what SIG would that go under? That'd probably be SIG architecture. If I haven't had those conversations, by the way, this is just me thinking aloud.
Sure.
Sana will also have issues with getting sufficient maintainers, so maybe donating would be a good thing.
Donating will not make new maintainers magically appear, I'm afraid.
To come with maintainers, I agree.
So in terms of status for this, is there a job and is it currently running and giving us signal, or do we need a job and then we need to walk it through at least making it into release informing?
So there is a job that's being kicked out because they're having trouble. It's not supposed to be there on Kubernetes infrastructure, and that's where we're trying to change the signal, that not the politics, but we need to make it okay for the API snoop and the conformance stuff to run there, so we can leave it. It's not necessarily making the job, but it's giving the job the right amount of signal.
Okay.
And is it using Sonoboy or is it using something else?
Not using Sonoboy. This is the
Okay.
release. It should be the release informing, release blocking job for promotions, and we're just trying to make sure new things don't promote. This other job doesn't exist for, does Sonoboy work? Does the submission process work? We are the signal. We watch it, and people complain really quick and heavily when it doesn't work. And it makes us dance a bit. Thanks for taking notes, Liggett. I'm in a loud place and I can't do notes while I'm.
Yeah, no worries. I'm just trying to capture what we're talking about. So it sounds like this issue, the like API snoop stuff, that's a prereq to resolving that first point. For the second one, detecting Sonoboy or whatever tool people are using, currently it sounds like it's Sonoboy. We don't currently have a job for that, so that would be a distinct effort. Yeah, if you want to send this first one to the mailing list, hopefully we get a little more engagement there and give folks a chance.
Absolutely.
All right, moving on to the last item.
Just mentioning, thanks Jordan for the intensive review there. It was very helpful. Got that 12 points in. We'll bring the promotion in the next 2 weeks. It's running nice and green.
Cool. And I did want to call out, like, I appreciated the pattern that followed, where instead of having like one test that narrowly tested one thing, it was, you know, a test that was sort of a table test that will actually be really easy to add new groups and types to in the future. So that I really like seeing that.
Yeah, thanks for your help on that as well.
Cool. Well, that is the end of our agenda. Did anyone want to go back to any of the previous topics or bring up anything additional? Just as a heads up, I am actually out of the office for all of June. So I've been trying to tell everybody that I'm working with for 128 stuff to catch me this month if you need things from me. But it's just a further signal boost to anyone here. If you need stuff from me, I am very available for 17 more days, working days. And then I will be out.
Jordan's been threatening to not come back.
I did not say that at all. I promised I would come back. We're doing a national park trip. We're excited about that.
Nice.
All right. Well, if no one has anything else, we'll call it there. And I appreciate the discussion. Look forward to seeing the kubelet merge stuff. That we've wanted that for a long time. We just always struggled to figure out how to do it. So I'm excited to see some of that happen.
All the best, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.